Bum 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 bum.
Tomatoes?
Hello, welcome to the video for what is material, the if node. So let's go ahead and cover what the if node does and how we're going to go ahead and use it. So our if node, if you're used to normal programming, is going to work pretty much the same. The difference being the if node is pretty strict in terms of its setup. You're not going to connect anything before it, such as greater than or less than. It already has those built into the inputs, and you're just going to hook up however you want it to use it. So let's look over it. The if node has 5 inputs, and it has 1 output, and then it has 2 parameters that we can adjust. So let's cover the parameters. Basically, you have your threshold for the equals and the constant b. If you notice here, I have an error. Well, it's because we're missing our A input. The A input is required. Obviously, we need to compare 2 different things. And it's going to require 1 input to determine whether or not we have anything to compare it to. So let me go and plug in my texture sample, and we're actually going to get a different error. An issue I'm going to have here is this is expecting a float value on my if. This is not a float value. This is going to be a vector 4, basically. So let's say, for example, I was to hook up my other inputs. Let's do something like this. Oops. And you'll notice now I get that error point. If input A must be of type float. So you need to keep that in mind. You're not going to be able to compare 2 textures. It's an if. It's meant to compare 2 float values. Well, we can easily plug in our red channel, because our red channel is going to be black or white based on the input. So let's look at the rest of this, and you can now see the result I got. What are we doing? Well, like a normal if, we need to plug in a b value to compare it to. You can either plug it in, or you can use the constant if it's not plugged in. It's your choice. That's why you notice it's grayed out. Now your A is greater than or equal, and your A is less than. Both must be hooked up. These are not optional. You need a result basically if it's greater than or equal or less than. So in our case, what we're doing is inside of our texture sample, we have our little black and white image here. Now, of course, black and white, black is 0 and white is 1. So inside of our noise texture, we have different values between a 0 and a 1. What we're telling our if node to do here is, if our b value is greater than or equal to, our a value is greater than or equal to our b value. So if any of these values in here are greater than 0.2, we're going to make them red. If any of the values are less than 0.2, we're going to make them green. And as you can see here, this is our result. Let's go and make it a flat plane, and we can compare it to our original. Technically, you could do this too. And we can compare it to our original input, where you can see our wider parts, because they're greater, are going to be red, and our darker parts, because they're less than 0.2, are going to be green. And of course, it is adjustable. We can unhook the B value. Right now, you're going to end up with completely red, because now that I haven't hooked it up, obviously we're using our constant B. We're saying 0.0. Everything's going to be greater than 0.0, and therefore we're going to have a constant red. If we wanted this to be more green, we can make it something like 0.6, and now we're going to have a lot more green instead of white. That's it. That's what our if node is for. As you noticed here, we have one more node that we did not use. It is completely optional. It's an equal node, which means if A is equal to B, then we're going to go ahead and have a third result. It's completely optional. You don't have to use it because, as you can see here, you have the greater than or equal B value. This will override this unless this, the A equals B, is plugged in. If the A equals B is plugged in, you have an equal threshold that is going to be able to be used here. Basically, this is your tolerance. How exact is it going to be? For example, 0.5 and 0.5 would be equal. Now, if you change this threshold to something like 0.1, then 0.5, 0.4, and 0.6 are all going to be equal to each other based on our equal threshold. So that's it. That's what our if node is good for. It's useful if you want to compare and do things. Let's say, for example, you wanted half this image to be black and, well, obviously it's black and white, so it doesn't really help. But you could, for example, have two different results. If someone puts in a dynamic parameter, maybe you want to adjust it where there's a threshold. Maybe you want to adjust it where certain colors pop out. It's an if node. Basically, if you have two different results based on an input, you want to use an if node. That's it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below.